Welcome to Rotted Reviews, and I'm here on location in the Nevada desert in celebration of covering another full franchise review, this time, Tremors. That's right, it's time for another full breakdown of an entire franchise, including all 7 movies and the limited one-season TV show. Tremors was a series that was incredibly impactful to my teenage years and my movie-loving self. But I'm also ashamed to say that I kinda dropped the ball on it. I watched the first film more times than I can possibly count. The second, a couple. The third, once, and I didn't really remember a whole lot about it, and I kinda dropped off from there. So when I was trying to decide what franchise to tackle next, I thought, well, why not go ahead and give this one a whirl? I have a feeling there might be 1 or 2 of you out there that wound up in the same boat, where you watched the first film, maybe the second, and then you kinda dropped off from the series. So I'm here to guide you through it in spoiler-free fashion and walk you through everything Tremors. Now, before we get into this review, there's 1 or 2 things that I want to cover ahead of time. First of all, if you like this channel and you've been digging my content, please click subscribe. It really does help me out a lot. And second, in celebration of this video, which I've been extremely excited to make, I went ahead and made a new design on the Rotted store. Please check it out. It's Tremors, it's 𝗘𝗾𝗄𝗵𝗺, it's everything that you love about graboids, shriekers, and ass blasters. Celebrate the alma mater of 𝗘𝗾𝗵𝗺's School of Survival. And like all Rotted ranking videos where I cover an entire franchise, what I'll be doing is covering each segment in chronological as it was released order, with a little mini review, spoiler-free, a little score, and then at the end, everything will get tallied. If you want to skip around and you're the impatient type, that's perfectly fine. I get it. I'm going to be including chapter markers down here so that you can go ahead and skip wherever you want. Without further ado, let's go to perfection. Alright, so the one that started it all, and at the risk of spoiling the rest of this video, the best entry in the series, the 1990 classic, Tremors. In this movie, we get introduced to the citizens of Perfection, a small little isolated community out in the Nevada desert, as they are beset upon by a series of underground worms. That's the movie! But just like Kevin Bacon himself, before this film's release, as he collapsed to the sidewalk and yelled at his wife, "I can't believe I made a movie about gigantic worms," it's easy to dismiss this one without looking underneath the surface at the heart within. Written and directed by Ron Underwood and also written by Brett Maddock and S.S. Wilson, this is a movie that shines bright in large part due to its characters. Throughout most of this movie, we follow the characters of Earl and Val, played by Fred Ward and Kevin Bacon, respectively, as 2 jack-of-all-trades handymen that are seeking a better life, and they realize that it can't be found within the confines of this little town, so they set their sights on packing up their truck and heading out. Unfortunately, every step of the way seems to be impeded by one tragedy or another that all comes down to these worms. With the help of Rhonda, a nearby seismology graduate student who's investigating these vibrations under the ground, played by Finn Carter, they come to realize together that these worms are attracted to any sort of sound or vibration. So if you're taking a step or making a noise, you could be a graboid's lunch if you're standing on the bare earth. Now, typically, when I make these kind of videos, I really try and refresh myself with every single movie within, especially if it's been longer than a week since I've seen it. I really want to make sure that I have everything up to date. But I was kind of struggling about this one because I've seen it so many times, I have it pretty much memorized, and if I wanted to recall it in my mind's eye, I could do it with a startling level of visual accuracy. So really, I didn't need to watch this one, but you know what? I did anyway. It's not because in this case I needed to, it's because I wanted to. This movie is such a treat, I will never turn down an opportunity to kick on Tremors. There's so much to love about this film. The characters are vibrant and interesting. Despite the simplistic plot and the monster creature feature kind of aesthetic to it, it has a surprising amount of depth and intelligence to the storyline.
Hey! Hey, check this out! I found the ass end! Jesus, we really caught something here!
Everybody in this feels alive and vibrant and somehow relatable. It's a wonderful thing to see on screen, and as far as the monsters and the creatures of the graboids themselves, it's one of the best examples of on-set practical effects I've ever seen put to film. The puppetry and so forth was amazing in this, and that's pretty astounding considering this was working within the confines of a fairly limited budget. Granted, the magic and the majesty of this movie took a little while to find traction. This did not do so well in the theaters. However, like a lot of 90s movies like The Shawshank Redemption, this movie found its footing in the home video market. Once this VHS started hitting the store shelves, it started flying off of them as it found its way into the living room of almost everybody in America. However, that kind of thing does take time and it does take traction, and that's probably why it was another 6 years before we got the sequel to this film. Now, speaking of sequels, I do want to bring up a scene in this movie, and again, things are going to be spoiler-free, but I still want to highlight this scene in particular. It takes place in the rec room of Bert and Heather Gummer's house. Bert and Heather, played by Michael Gross and Reba McEntire, are under siege by a graboid who has broken through the wall and is attempting to gobble them up. And just as they run out of ammunition of the guns in their hands, they move over to a previously unseen wall as the camera pans with them and we see a barrage of weaponry. This was a fan favorite moment of ridiculousness, but the reason I want to highlight this scene in particular is because I think this scene, more than any other, carries forward as the series continues. I estimate that it's this scene in particular that the sequels moving from here on out will use as a template for the tone and the pacing and the spirit of the Tremors franchise. So if you're watching the original Tremors and this scene doesn't work for you, I'm afraid the sequels probably won't either. If you're watching Tremors and the entire movie doesn't work for you, I absolutely guarantee that the sequels won't. So it's probably best to just bow out now. But if you're one of those people that love this movie and love that scene, I dare say it's worth giving the sequels a fair shake. So let's go ahead and do that now as we move on to movie number 2. Tremors 2: Aftershocks. This time, S.S. Wilson moves from writer into the writer/director seat as they take the helm and reintroduce the character of Earl, played by Fred Ward. Apparently, they tried to get Kevin Bacon and Reba McEntire back on board, but Reba was busy with a big tour and Kevin was busy with the opportunity of Apollo 13, which, all things considered, as unfortunate as it was, he wasn't in this one. Yeah, I can kind of understand that. And we find Earl a little bit down and out. He's living in a dumpy old trailer raising ostriches, apparently having squandered all the money that he made in interviews, magazine spots, and so forth after finding the graboids from the first film. So when Grady Hoover winds up on his doorstep, played by Chris Harton, and offers him a whole lot of cash to go down to Mexico and hunt down graboids that have been found there that are threatening the operation of an oil field, he really can't pass up on the opportunity. Taking some of the lessons that he learned from the first film and employing them into the field here, he operates with kind of a fishing expedition where he drives a little remote RC car out there, lets the graboid take it down, and then presses boom on the explosives attached. Unfortunately, at some point, Earl and Grady do wind up biting off a little bit more than they can chew, and they re-enlist the help of Bert Gummer, who is himself a bit down and out, using the absence of Reba McEntire to work in a storyline of his wife left him, and now he's kind of aimless, directionless, sitting in a chair, not doing a whole lot. This was the perfect call to arms to get him off his butt and back out shooting guns. But those aren't the only changes that happen in this movie. The graboids themselves undergo a bit of a transformation. As the movie progresses, we find that the graboids are reacting in a bit of an odd fashion. Instead of attacking things, now all of a sudden they're lying dormant and seemingly sick. And sick is about as good of a word as I can think of, because at some point they do explode and transmogrify into 3 Shriekers. Shriekers being little land Precambrian dinosaurs that are just kind of trouncing around, able to bite through an engine block, and instead of being sensitive to sound and vibrations, they are instead very sensitive to heat. Little flaps rise up out of their head and they can sense heat wherever it may be. So what they lack in the enormity and the silent, unseen threat that the graboids provided, they instead make up for with just pure viciousness, as well as the ability to propagate very easily. You see, anytime they fill their belly belly with food, they multiply through some manner of asexual reproduction. So my thoughts on this one are that it was an enjoyable movie. I had a lot of fun with it, hands down. However, it did lack a lot of the special something that made the first film so great. Some people, including myself, would say that it's heart, however definable or quantifiable that could be, but nevertheless, I did still have fun with it. I found it to be a thoroughly entertaining watch, even if it was a little bit lackluster in the shadow of the original. Additionally, this is the start of something great for the series. You see, this takes the character of 𝗵𝗾𝗺𝗻, and instead of having him operate as just another secondary character that happens to be a gun nut, we instead actually start to see him emerge as a little bit of an action star, which becomes the theme of the entirety of the Tremors franchise from here.
I feel I was denied critical, need-to-know information.
Look, Mr. Family Ties Michael Gross might seem like an odd choice to turn into an action star, but he so encapsulates the 𝗵𝗾𝗺𝗻 character that I can't help but root for him no matter how weird and down the rabbit hole this character goes eventually. I dare say that it's a lot more natural and a lot less of an ask of the audience than Phantasm attempting to turn Reggie into an action star. I think for me, if I were to really point out a major miss with this film, it would be in the Chris Hardin performance of Grady Hoover. Honestly, just having him play opposite of Earl sometimes worked, but for the most part was just an irritating counterpoint that provided a whole lot of energy, but really no substance. I'm not going to be one of those immovable objects that's going to stand here and say, if it's not Kevin Bacon, then it's not anybody. I get that you can have somebody else to fill the shoes, but I dare say that the Grady Hoover character just wasn't it. I didn't feel any real chemistry between him and the Earl character, and it just came off as annoying more than anything else. Fortunately, he doesn't dominate the majority of the screen time, but where he is there, it's just kind of turning something that could be really decent into something that's just a little bit mediocre in those moments. But eventually we do move away from Mexico, and where do we go from there? I'll tell you, back to perfection. The 2001 movie Tremors 3, Back to Perfection. This movie lives up to its subtitle heading in more ways than one, as we not only physically go back to Perfection, Nevada, but we also have many characters and the actors reprising their roles from the first film. Charlotte Stewart is back as Nancy, Ariana Richards is back as Mindy, Tony Gennaro is back as Miguel, and Michael Gross is back as 𝗵𝗾𝗺𝗻, this time taking the helm and being the lead action star hero of the film. Coming back from Mexico, we get to see what happened to Perfection after the events of the first movie, and the two most notable changes is family member Jody taking over the convenience store from Walter, and a new character in town, Desert Jack Sawyer, played by Sean Christian, who operates a graboid tour group. And just when it looks like everything is safe and this tour group is putting on the facade of graboids, of course, things start getting real. We get the graboids, and just like the second movie, the graboids turn into Shriekers, and in this movie, the Shriekers turn into ass blasters. After emerging from the graboids in the fashion we've already seen, the Shriekers will eventually molt and turn into ass blasters, which is kind of a flying version of themselves, only now they have kind of an elongated beak, for a lack of a better word, and they store a certain volatile substance in their abdomen, which allows them to release violently through the posterior and glide from there. Other than that, the principles are largely the same. They still have the heat sensors on top of their head, and they are a life-threatening menace. Again, this is missing some of that certain something from the first movie, that little bit of heart, and honestly, I'm just going to stop saying that. You can just assume that that's the way it is in perpetuity from here. None of the entries moving forward have the same kind of heart encapsulated in them that was present in the first film. But this was just whole heaps of fun, and taking the 𝗵𝗾𝗺𝗻 character and putting him first and foremost on the front stage, as well as dialing down some of the more annoying attributes of the second film. And I think that we wind up with something that quality-wise and entertainment-wise winds up right in the middle of the first two movies. The situations that are occurring, the over-the-top sequences, and the one-liners are abound in this film, but that's what makes it so wonderful. The Desert Jack and the Jody characters are both wonderful little additions to kind of make up for, let's just say, some population decline, and I think that they worked in the benefit of the film greatly. At this point, just hearing some people's comments on it, you'd think that this was along the lines of a Sharknado kind of sci-fi original, and I would submit that it's not even close to that yet. The entertainment is there, the quality is there, the special effects are there. It's not really reaching the sci-fi original cheese fest quite yet. One little plot element I kind of need to bring up right now, I'm still not going to get into spoilers, but nevertheless this does carry forward into the future, and that is the presence of 𝗘𝗾𝘂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀, a graboid that has albino qualities as well as a sterility to him so that he doesn't actually morph into Shriekers. He stays a graboid and is a little bit more of a passive presence than his other graboid brethren. And how does that move forward into the future? Well, let's find out with the next entry. The 2003 one-season, 13-episode-long series, Tremors. So here's how this journey went for me personally, is I watched all of the movies straight through in preparation for this video. And then I thought to myself, well, what about that one-season TV show? I had never seen it before. I was kind of waffling on whether or not to include it in this, and I kind of realized that if I didn't, I'd be kicking myself every moment I thought of this video in the future. So to the completionist side of myself, yes, I watched all 13 episodes of Tremors the series, and here's the thing is, by the time I was done with the movies, one of the challenges of doing these kind of ranking videos is making it all the way through a franchise, and no matter how much you love it, not getting burned out by it. And nevertheless, after finishing watching all of the movies, I still did not feel burned out by Tremors. The TV show is the one that did that. After watching this series, I was absolutely Tremorsed out. And that was due to a number of factors. Most notably, I think that for an episodic series about Tremors, what are you really going to do with this? This was made in 2003, but it honestly felt more like a mid to late 90s kind of character serial drama situation, Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, that kind of thing. There was a cheesiness to it. There was a different brand of cheesiness, a lower budget, more commercially accessible cheesiness than I really grew to love it. So in Tremors the series, we pick directly back up where the third movie left off. We have 𝗘𝗾𝘂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀 the graboid that is not necessarily terrorizing the town of Perfection anymore, but with the use of seismic watches and meters and so forth, has just become kind of their way of living. It's almost become a bit of a symbiotic relationship. Desert Jack has been replaced by Tyler Reed, played by Victor Brown, who's basically just Desert Jack with a different actor. We also have Jody and Nancy returning with different actors, Leela Lee and Marcia Strausman, respectively, and the addition of Rosalita, played by 𝗘𝗾𝘂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀𝗀 Jimenez, and W.D. Twitchell, played by the iconic Breaking Bad Dean Norris. And of course, reprising his role as 𝗘𝗾𝘂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀 is Michael Gross. And the situation that's happening with 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀 and why I say it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship is because, well, 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀's been classified as an endangered species, so they legally can't touch him. But at the same time, there's developers that are trying to get them out of town so that they can build new properties, including Melvin reprising his role from the first and third movies by Robert Jane. And 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀's presence kind of prevents outside entities from interfering with them. Nobody actually wants to live in a condo that has a graboid coming up through the ground every few minutes. So it's a bit of an impasse. 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀 can't turn into Shriekers. He's basically dealt with on a passive level, and everybody kind of stays calm. Which begs the question, what do you do with that? How does that turn into a series? Well, across the 13 episodes, there's kind of one of three different scenarios that tend to play out. One is we wind up in a situation where something on an outside entity is threatening the symbiotic relationship that is happening between Perfection and 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀. We have Agent W.D. Twitchell sending Bert and Tyler out across the nation or the world to deal with situations of graboids, Shriekers, or ass blasters popping up here and there. And lastly, through the introduction of Dr. 𝗘𝗾𝗋𝗄𝗃 𝗘𝗾𝗵𝗺𝗀𝗀, played by Christopher Lloyd, we wind up with a little bit of a monster/mystery of the week. It comes to light that there may be a secret laboratory buried underneath the town of Perfection somewhere that still has some entities long abandoned in there but may yet be dormant and coming to the surface. So then we wind up with creatures with genetic splicing, bacteria clouds, all sorts of different stuff. The problem was none of it was that terribly interesting. I gotta be honest, I didn't really mind the show that much, but I didn't enjoy it a whole lot. It felt like a pretty weak way to end the series for me. So if you're gonna undergo a full watch through of everything Tremors, I would recommend doing it in chronological order. Watch this after watching Tremors 3. At the very least, you'll be able to pick the movies back up and hopefully get a little bit more re-energized. Don't make my mistake. Don't save this one for the end. It wasn't that terribly interesting. And that kind of tracks with having a TV budget and not being able to show a whole lot of great gory kills and relying on old archive footage and possibly dusting off some old decrepit puppets that you may have from previous productions. It's just not going to hit the same. I mean, hell, the last two episodes didn't even have 𝗵𝗺𝗺𝗀𝗀 in them. And if you're going to undergo a big Tremors watch, that's a pretty weak way to finish things off. So where do we go from here? Back to Mexico? Nope. Back in time. Tremors 4, The Legend Begins. This tells the story of how Perfection came to be back in 1889 when it was called Rejection, Nevada, a sad little desert town that didn't have a whole lot of occupants because Carson City nearby was more of the destination for everybody. Nevertheless, there's an inn, there's a market, and there's a silver mine. Unfortunately, the silver mine is starting to become beset upon by problems of miners getting mysteriously killed. So with the silver mine effectively shut down, the mine's owner travels all the way from Philadelphia to see what the hell is going on here and how to spin things back up. And that's where we get introduced to the character of Hiram Gummer. And Hiram is not at all cut from the same cloth that his ancestor Bert will be going down the road. Instead, he's very much a city man, doesn't carry a gun, very delicate sensibilities, and not at all a killer. So all throughout the movie, Hiram and the townsfolk are trying to figure out a way to stop these worms and get the mine back up and running. He wants money from the operation, and they want to make a living. Unfortunately, not a whole lot can get done until the graboids are gone. Meanwhile, Hiram, with his soft demeanor, is kind of disappointing the townsfolk at every opportunity and not at all living up to the prophecy that was foretold by his arrival. Can he find the courage inside and rise up to live up to the Gummer name and start killing him some graboids? Well, you find out in this movie. I think a lot of people had some issue with the nature of the Gummer character changing. I mean, going back in time and having the ancestor of Bert Gummer, also played by Michael Gross, come to life as Hiram, and then change the character so dramatically was a little bit of a shift for folks. But honestly, I think that it worked beautifully. It was a good change of pace for the character, and switching things up isn't always a bad thing. It's a nice little palate refresher to kind of come up with something new. If it was just Bert Gummer going up against graboids again, I don't know that it would have been that engaging, but to see somebody that is actually struggling with himself, and then the mayhem and carnage that kind of ensues from there through steam engines and 2-inch bore punt guns, I think that it was worth the patience necessary to see the Hiram character try to come into his own. Moreover, I think that it was actually a pretty decent Western on top of it. This dealt with some fairly generic Old West movie tropes like the gunslingers and so forth, but it still was very fun and very fascinating, and I think that it did that portion of things well. Additionally, the supporting cast that was surrounding Hiram Gummer in the town of Rejection played their roles very well. It was just a lot of fun and an interesting take on a franchise that very easily, at this point, could have gone stale. So we've gone to Nevada, we've gone to Mexico, we've gone back in time. Where from here? Africa, I guess. Tremors 5, Bloodlines, 2015, directed by Don Michael Paul, and the first entry so far that isn't involved with Stampede Entertainment. Instead, Universal decided to maintain all creative control and made this entirely in-house. And after 11 years, it was kind of thought of as potentially a relaunch of the series, not a reboot. This is continuing where the last ones left off, but even so, it was kind of that revitalization, the effort to take an existing property and see if there's any life left in it. So in this, we get Michael Gross Gross returning as the iconic, insufferable 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀. And now his new sidekick, 𝗘𝗾𝘂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗀, is a fresh cameraman that's been following Burt around, making a survivalist videotape series played by Jamie Kennedy. And after these two characters are introduced to one another in the audience, the movie really starts kicking off when they're both approached by agents of the South African Wildlife Ministry about an ass blaster problem. So they take up the call and head over there to see what they can do to help. Unfortunately, as soon as they arrive, all of Burt's arsenal is taken away from him. It's not uncommon for Americans to show up brandishing all sorts of firearms, and for obvious reasons, that's frowned upon. So they have to make do with what limited resources the agency is able to provide for them. So not only is Burt going into this with one hand tied behind his back, but the Precambrian baddies in this film also have a few little surprises in store for him, with their South African cousin brethren being slightly different than the North American ones he's dealt with in the past. So as that might allude to, some of the monster elements in this film kind of get a little bit of an upgrade in some ways and a downgrade in others. We're really not dealing with a whole lot of practical effects at this point, and it's been a while since we've been dealing with entire practical effects. Instead, we're relying on CG modeling, but at the same time, in 2015, it's not bad. Even the straight-to-video, low-budget stuff isn't bad, and some of the new elements that they added to the graboids are pretty impressive. They try and explain it along the lines of this South African variety is a bit thinner, a bit sleeker, has the ability to jump out of the sand and so forth, but really what it amounts to is just trying to inject some new material and not just completely rehash the old stuff, and have a few new surprises for us, which I think this movie does very successfully. As far as the characters themselves go, 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 has turned into a caricature of himself, but that's not a bad thing. I think it's just kind of natural and everybody was expecting it. It's just leaning into the character and all of his various eccentricities. However, we are dealing with a pairing at this point, with Burt being alongside Travis, and how well does Michael Gross really interact with Jamie Kennedy? I was fearing something along the lines of the Earl and sidekick elements of Tremors 2 that just didn't work for me, and to a degree, that's kind of what happened here. Jamie Kennedy playing Travis kind of felt a bit superfluous and a bit annoying at first. As the movie progressed and the characters started developing, and yes, there was some development happening, I think that he kind of came into his own, and I'll be explaining this a little bit more in the next segment because Jamie Kennedy reprises his role in the next film. But what he winds up becoming there, we start to see the shades of here, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't work. We are starting to get into some pretty darn cheesy elements with this one, but not at all sci-fi original bad. It's not getting there yet, and I've heard plenty of people talk about the franchise as being downhill from this point, and honestly, I don't see it. It's still fun. It's still entertaining. It's still vibrant. Yes, some of the plot elements of this one were a bit of a lull. The character interactions didn't always work, but this movie was fun. This kind of goes back to what I was saying with the first movie and that rec room scene and it being the template for what the future movies would ultimately become. If 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 hasn't worked for you by this point, he never will. He's only going to get more and more and more Burt. And that's perfectly fine. It can be argued that by the fifth entry in the series that this has transitioned from a Tremors franchise into a Michael Gross 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 franchise. And to that I say, yeah, maybe it has, but it's also done so quite successfully. So in the next movie, are they going to take a step back? Are they going to get less zany? Are they going to focus a little bit less on Burt? That'd be a cold day in hell. The 2018 direct-to-video movie Tremors: A Cold Day in Hell. Ditching the numerical system and absconding with the potential number 6, this movie takes place primarily in Canada. When an Arctic researcher is killed by a graboid, they reach out to none other than 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 and Travis Welker, who are still residing in Perfection, this time manning the store for Jody, while at the same time being hounded by a tax collector that's pretty much taken everything that Burt has. So with the possibility of earning a little bit of extra scratch and the benefit of getting out of the country for a little bit, off to Canada they go. To the Nunavut territory, which houses a research station, and right next door, a DARPA center. This gets Bert's conspiratorial head all a-tingling, while at the same time his body's kind of giving up the ghost on him. He kind of goes through some weird dizzy spells that eventually turn into fainting spells, come to find out that all of his interactions with graboids and so forth in the past have affected him with a virus, and now he's a bit down for the count. And the researchers at the station have surmised that the only cure for Bert can only be found in a live graboid. Can Travis and his research team capture a grown graboid alive? How many people might die in the process to save Bert's life? A lot of questions abound, and a hell of a ride in this film. I'm going to be honest, I kind of like this movie better than the fifth one. I thought it was more fun, more engaging, a little bit more off the wall in the best ways, and having Bert kind of be a sick presence in this movie, still allowing him to have his Bert Gummer moments, certainly, but still be vulnerable, I think was not necessary, but it was an interesting element to add to the mix. Where I was mentioning in the fifth film, as it kind of gradually went on, the Jamie Kennedy character of Travis started to come into his own a bit more. I think that kind of fully fleshes out here, and by having Bert kind of take a little bit more of a back seat, it allowed the Travis character to kind of rise up. I'm not the biggest Jamie Kennedy fan out there, but I do admit that his portrayal of Travis in this film, more than the last, was pretty darn decent. They didn't seem to be trying to do a full passing of the torch from Bert to Travis, and I think that would have been a mistake, but instead it just allowed him to rise up and say that this particular character could stand side by side with the great Gummer. And honestly, any of those mistakes in this film almost add to the charm. Some people might say them as negatives, but to me, it just makes the movie that much more just wacky. Like the fact that even though an Arctic researcher got attacked and it's called A Cold Day in Hell, it looks kind of balmy. And the fact of the matter is that this movie was filmed in South Africa at the same place that Tremors 5 was. They chalked it up in the storyline to say global warming, and they used a few filter effects to make the desert look more snow-like, but again, that's the kind of thing that just makes me smile and laugh. As I'm watching these characters and I'm feeling sorry for the actors that are running around in big, thick, heavy coats in South Africa, I still can't help but just shake my head, smile, and just let the experience wash over me with the sense of just cheesy fun that it is. So after going to Nevada, Mexico, back in time, Africa, and Canada, where else is there from here? Well, I think it's time to get a little tropical. And the last movie in the Tremors franchise, probably ever, is the 2020 movie Tremors Shrieker Island. Despite the singularity of the title, this movie actually takes place primarily on 2 islands, one of which is a bright, lush, inviting environment with research stations and scientists, including Jon Heter's character, and the other one employs a different LUT altogether. Despite being a short boat ride away, this island has a very dark and mysterious presence about it, and is run by big game hunter Bill. Bill is a businessman that invites ultra-rich hunters onto his island to tackle the biggest game around, graboids. Of course, things don't go quite as planned when the scientists on the nice island get curious and the graboids turn into Shriekers as they do, and the Shriekers attack some of them. So they enlist the help of Bert Gummer, who happens to be isolating on an entirely different island of his own, this time with long hair and a beard, basically just trying to get away from all manner of civilization, never to be bothered again. Well, until today. After some convincing and hemming and hawing, Hermit Bert turns back into Action Bert as he heads over to the nice island to try and figure out what's going on and how to stop it. Again, with fairly limited resources, being a research station, they don't exactly have a military arsenal at their disposal. So Jamie Kennedy's character does not reprise his role, and they explain his character's absence in this, and instead Bert gets teamed up with Jon Heter's character, Jimmy. Now I would have to say that of this movie and the last 2, the trilogy that was done without Stampede Entertainment, this is my favorite. Bill proved to be an exceptionally fascinating character that was a fantastic counterpoint to Bert Gummer, and he was played wonderfully by Richard Brake. Additionally, Jon Heter's character, playing the reluctant partner to Bert, I thought worked pretty well. It was very much as anti-Napoleon Dynamite as he could muster, and I thought that he did a fairly decent job in this performance. It was clear that they weren't trying to do anything along the lines of what they did with the last 2, as far as grooming him to be the next Bert or anything even remotely close to that. He simply was Jimmy, but as a sidekick character, I thought he held his own really well. And again, this is a Tremors movie. The name of the game is big creature monster mayhem fun. And to that end, this movie delivered wildly. Yes, we have gotten completely and fully away from the amount of heart that the first movie offered, but we've kind of transitioned slowly into something else. Something that on the one hand is a little bit more hollow, but on the other hand is just more of a spectacle. And yes, what I said at the beginning of this segment about it being most likely the last entry, well, that kind of holds true. I think that this movie really kind of wrapped up the storyline nicely in a way that nobody really has to come back, and it would honestly feel a little awkward if they tried. At this point, we've already had an attempted resurgence of the Tremors franchise that's failed. Back in 2018, there was an attempt to bring the Tremors franchise back to life with a new revitalized TV show, and they even shot and teased a pilot in which Kevin Bacon returned, but it went nowhere, and try as I might, I could not find a copy for the life of me. I was really hoping that I could watch it and include it in this video, but no dice. So on the heels of that and the notion that Michael Gross is getting a little bit up there in years to be an action star anymore, I think it was kind of appropriate that they had one last hurrah and kind of put a pin in the rest of it. So there we go, 7 movies and a TV show. Let's go ahead and tally up the figures. So here we have it. All the movies have been watched, all the scores have been tallied, and here's the ranking. Not surprisingly, the original Tremors winds up at the top of the heap. It was just one of my favorite movies ever, and there was no way that a sequel was really going to surpass it. Nevertheless, the rest of the series did something that I truly didn't expect. Just the way that people were talking about some of the later entries into the series, I was bracing myself for some very awful four-headed shark attack kind of mayhem. But instead, I found that I actually got some pretty decent quality movies that just put emphasis on fun. Again, most times when I go and blast through a franchise like this, by the time I get to the end of them, I am just burned out. I never want to watch another one ever again. And that's just not the case with this. Aside from the TV show, I found myself just having a wild, fun time, and I never regretted a minute of it. We're not talking high art cinema, and it's never even tried to pretend to be. Even as a monster movie, a lot of times the best creature features out there will have some socio-political subtext that makes them stand out above the rest. The original Godzilla and even Shin Godzilla, which is a fantastic movie, are great examples of that. But one thing that Tremors did very well was prove that you could have something that was engaging and fun with interesting characters, great effects, great monsters, thrills aplenty, chills abound, and just be that. It was pure distilled monster mayhem, and I love this series for that. So, all told, I had a blast making this video, and I hope you had just a fraction of the amount of fun I had making it watching it. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It would help me out a whole lot. And remember, next time you want to watch a monster movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.